After studying this module, you shall be able to know about how fiscal reforms are needed for macroeconomic stabilization, understand the need for revenue or tax reforms, assess the nature of expenditure reforms and management, understand the issues related to increasing debt burden and debt reforms, analyze the recommendations of FRBM and Kelker Committee report.
The need for fiscal reforms was being felt for quite some time, but the urgency to take some effective measures for fiscal correction became apparent during the late 1980s due to rapid deterioration in government finances. Central and state expenditures were increasing steeply and much faster than their revenues receipts and grants. The growing fiscal deficit manifested in a sharp increase in outstanding liabilities, which led to a huge increase in debt servicing. The primary objective of the fiscal reforms initiated in the Union Budget of 1991-92 was to achieve a reduction in the size of fiscal deficit and public debt through revenue enhancement and curtailment of current expenditure, and at the same time stepping up investment expenditure, particularly spending on infrastructure to provide further momentum to the growth process. The key issues in fiscal correction are to work out a policy mechanism that ensures higher growth rate in short run by promoting higher rate of both public and private savings, as well as judicious utilization of financial resources through more productive investment. Fiscal reforms comprise of revenue or tax reforms, expenditure and debt management, and better coordination between monetary and fiscal policies. Apart from augmenting public revenues, fiscal reforms aim at pruning public expenditure through measures that reduce the growth rate of government's non-productive expenses, such as expenditure on administration, wages and salaries of employees, and unnecessary expansion of manpower in government departments. All subsidies need to be reviewed and cost-based user charges for public services, wherever feasible, need to be imposed. The main focus is on downsizing government and reducing role of administrative structure.
There are three components of fiscal reforms. 1. Revenue reforms. 2. Expenditure reforms and management. 3. Debt reforms. Let us start with the revenue reforms. The areas of fiscal reforms from raising more revenues should include expansion of tax base, imposition, user charges on all non-merit goods, imposition of taxes on services, widespread and bold program of disinvestment, expansion of tax base. In India, the possibility of raising higher revenues through increase in tax rate is neither feasible nor desirable. It can only be achieved by increasing the tax base, which means that more and more activities must be brought under the tax net. With economic development, the share of agriculture has gone down considerably, while that of industry and services sector has gone up. Since agriculture has remained largely untaxed, there is no loss of tax revenue on this account, but expansion of industry and services do offer a much greater scope for enhancing tax revenues. As the growth in industrial sector is also comparatively slow and the service sector contributes more than 50% of GDP, so there is potential in bringing more of the service sector under the tax net. User charges. Most of the public sector is made in providing public services like water supply, power, irrigation, transport, etc., which are supplied to people either free of cost or at a price much lower than the economic cost of providing these services. There is also substantial hidden subsidy involved in providing these services. Over the years, as these services have been provided free of cost, people's perception is that the government should solely bear their burden. Also, as their quality is very poor, so also people are not willing to even pay nominal charges for them. This vicious circle needs to be broken. So, user charges must be imposed to ensure reasonable returns on public investment in supplying these services. A major improvement also needs to be made in the quality of these services so that consumers are willing to pay a user charge for them. Sometimes the equity argument is used for justifying the non application of any charges to share the economic cost by the government. It is advocated that the poor cannot afford to pay an appropriate prices for the public services and will not be able to avail their benefit. However, the ground reality is that these services are mainly availed by better off sections of the society who have the ability to pay. The poor in the rural areas do not have land to avail free power for irrigation or get subsidized seeds and fertilizers. Hence, imposition of user charges will not adversely affect the welfare of the poor and will enhance the fiscal health of the government. Taxing services. An important aspect of fiscal rejuvenation is that the government must tax services and tap the service sector for large resource mobilization. In India, agriculture, which contributes to a fifth of the GDP, remains outside the scope of tax net. Industry that contributes to over one fourth of GDP is heavily taxed and does not offer any further scope for additional resource mobilization. The service sector, which accounts for half of the GDP, also remains largely untaxed. So, services must be brought under the tax net to meet the increasing financial requirements of the government. However, all services cannot be taxed, as services like defense, public administration, domestic services do not offer any scope of taxation. Meanwhile, services like transport, communication, hotels, and restaurants, insurance, and financial services, which have made tremendous progress in the process of country's economic development, must contribute to share the burden of fiscal needs of the government. Until 1994, there was no service tax, and the entire service sector was outside the tax net. Initially, service tax was levied on telephone services and general insurance. Over the years, more services have been added, and the service tax rates have been raised with the view to make the service sector the major source of revenue in the years to come. Another way to raise the resources is through disinvestment. To scale down and repay public debt, resources can be raised by sale proceeds by adopting the disinvestment program of public enterprises. Under this program, the government share in public enterprises is diluted through sale of their equity in the market to the private sector. Over the years, the public sector performance has dropped substantially, and they have proved to be a drain on the exchequer and burden on the nation. There is a need to recognize that privatizing the public sector would be the best way of making sure that the core of Indian industry grows, remain competitive, and is enabled to compete internationally. It should also be ensured that the returns from privatization must be strictly used to retire public debt to enable a reduction in interest burden. These proceeds must not be used to finance current expenditure, as it would defeat the very logic of privatization. Let us discuss the expenditure reforms and management. Apart from augmenting public revenues, fiscal reforms aims at pruning public expenditure through measures that reduce the growth rate of government's non-productive expenses, such as expenditure on administration, wages, and salaries of employees, and unnecessary expansion of manpower in government departments. All subsidies need to be reviewed, and cost based user charges for public services wherever feasible need to be imposed. The main focus is on downsizing government and reducing role of administrative structure. The government have constituted an expenditure reform commission to look into areas of expenditure correction. These areas include minimization of cost of buffer stock operations, rationalization of fertilizers subsidies, redeployment of surplus staff in various departments of the government, and government maintain autonomous organizations.
Public expenditure in India assumed significance in the context of the mixed economy model adopted since independence, whereby the primary responsibility of building the capital and infrastructure base rested with the government. The concerns regarding equity and poverty alleviation, particularly since the 1970s, added another important dimension to public expenditure in terms of redistribution of resources. The inadequate returns on the huge capital outlays over the years, as well as the macroeconomic crisis of 1991 stemming from high fiscal imbalances, led to a shift in the focus from mere size to efficiency in public expenditure management so as to facilitate adequate returns and restore macroeconomic stability. The cutbacks in capital outlay undertaken as part of the expenditure management in the first half of the 1990s, however, raised concerns over the inadequate infrastructural investment and repercussions on the long term growth potential. The upward movement in government revenue expenditure was partly responsible for fiscal deterioration, which set in during the latter half of 1990s. With a renewed commitment toward fiscal consolidation since 2003-4, reprioritization of expenditure and emphasis of outcomes rather than outlays are the guiding principles of public expenditure management.
Apart from the emphasis on undertaking large scale capital outlay, expenditure policy was also geared towards promotion of equity and social justice through public expenditure on social welfare and poverty alleviation schemes. Rural development received special attention in terms of larger outlays and directed lending by the newly nationalized banks. Several employment schemes were inaugurated and small scale industry, which was touted to promote employment, was given special privileges. Exchange control and industrial licensing were tightened during this period. Expenditure reforms in the context of liberalization have two aspects: consolidation so as to reduce the quantum of expenditure, restructuring with a view to changing the composition of government expenditure, that is, shift towards growth inducing expenditure on infrastructure and human resource development and reduction in unwarranted subsidies. A successful expenditure control policy should include the following: subjecting all ongoing schemes to zero based budgeting, assessment of manpower requirements of government departments, review of all subsidies, introducing cost based user charges wherever possible, review of budgetary support to autonomous institutions, greater commercialization of the operations of public sector enterprises, debt reforms. Governments obtained money by incurring public debt when they raise public loans. Such loans can be raised internally as domestic debts or externally as foreign debts. Internal borrowing of the government are mainly required to meet budgetary deficits. External borrowing assists in meeting deficit in the balance of payments. The public loans may be raised for short, medium, or long terms to meet an economy's requirements of development. Long term borrowing by a government are justified when the benefits of a capital project undertake by it are likely to be reaped over a long period of time. That is, by more than one generation of taxpayers. The financing of such projects should place the repayment burden on the present as well as future generation. If long-term capital projects are financed out of current revenues and or short-term borrowings, the future generations would enjoy free riding. Thus, it is both fair and efficient that projects with long term benefits are financed through long term borrowings. Some disturbing features of the debt profile of states and its management are diversion of borrowed funds for meeting revenue expenditure, use of loans in unproductive enterprises or enterprises which are potentially productive but are beset by poor performance and currently yielding low or even negative returns, non provision for depreciation or amortization funds, debt related relief to the states may be provided in various forms such as write offs, rescheduling of the loans with a view to shifting the timing of repayments, consolidation of past loans on common terms, and reduction of interest rate. Now let us throw some light on Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act 2003. In view of continuing deterioration in the fiscal condition of the country, the FRBM bill was passed by the Parliament in 2000 to create the FRBM Act in August 2003. The FRBM Act aims at making the central government more responsible for achieving long term macroeconomic stability through prudent fiscal management. The provisions of the Act seek to place limits on government's borrowings and recurring deficits, remove impediments in effective conduct of monetary policy, and ensure prudential debt management. The Act aims at placing various checks on unproductive governmental spending and curtailing revenue expenditure on administration and other such activities while emphasizing the need to generate sufficient revenue surpluses. Kelker Committee Report on Fiscal Reforms. The Government of India appointed a committee headed by Vijay Kelkar to outline the strategy to meet the fiscal objective of FRBM Act. The committee was officially named the Task Force on Implementation of Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act 2004. The recommendation of the Kelker Committee deals with a wide range of reforms in direct taxes, indirect taxes, as well as government expenditure.
According to the committee, the Indian economy stands at the edge of a fiscal recipe, making fiscal consolidation imperative. India's fiscal deficit, the excess of government expenditure over receipts, is forecasted to expand to 6.1% of GDP, higher than the budget estimate of 5.1%. A high fiscal deficit can be problematic for many reasons. Inflation could increase, monetary policy expansion may be constrained, external sector imbalances could widen, and investment, growth and employment could all weaken. In addition, high fiscal deficits might reduce investors' confidence in India. The report highlights India's fiscal consolidation from 2002-3 to 2007-8 and suggests that fiscal discipline positively affected other economic variables like inflation and investment. The committee points to India's current investment decline, weak index of industrial production and widening current account deficits as sign of deepening fiscal crisis. In case of direct taxes, the committee recommended some concessions in personal income tax. No tax to be levied on income up to rupees 1 lakh per annum. A tax rate of 20% on income between 1 lakh to 4 lakhs and a 30% tax on income above 4 lakh. There should be withdrawal of numerous exemptions such as those given on PPF, post office savings schemes, etc., and standard deduction available to salaried employees. It was felt that the structure of exemptions should be removed in light of reduction in tax rates over the last 2 decades. The gap between the peak rate for personal income tax and corporate tax needs to be removed. In case of corporate tax, it was suggested to reduce it from present level of 35.875% to 30%.
The major highlight of the Kelker Committee report was the manner in which it aimed at overhauling the manner in which goods and services were taxed both at the central and state levels, taking in consideration the various distortion in the existing indirect tax structure and the flaws in administration. The Kelker Committee proposed a single nationwide tax called Goods and Service Tax to replace the Central Excise, Central Value Added Tax, CENVAT, Central Service Tax, Central Sales Tax, and state taxes like State Sales Tax, Electricity Tax, Entry Taxes, Stamp Duties, Octroi, etc.
The committee proposed a standard central rate of 12% to replace the CENVAT of 16% and a standard state rate of 8% to make GST a 20% value added tax. The proposed rate is comparable to the standard VAT rates in the developed countries. In case of custom duties, the committee proposed a substantial reduction in tariff rates. Recognizing the need for industry to be competitive and have ASEAN level of tariffs, it was recommended that a 3-tier custom duty structure of 5, 8 and 10% be adopted. While there would be loss of revenue, but this change was considered necessary to keep afloat in the era of competitive globalization. Kelker committee also proposed an expansion of the tax base with fewer and lower taxes. There should be simplification of tax procedures and reduction in the cost of compliance. It was believed that a high GDP growth rate along with a system that ensures better tax compliance through incentives facilitates and reduces cost of compliance will raise tax revenue. This would ensure that an important objective of FRBM Act, that is the centre's revenue deficit, is eliminated by 2008-9 and the total borrowings are contained within 3% of GDP. The Kelker committee also made suggestions for strengthening the tax administration, identifying tax evaders and evolving a taxpayer friendly system. Let us now recapitulate what we have learned in this module. Fiscal policy assumes a central place in the overall macroeconomic framework. Fiscal reforms have initiated a right kind of approach to maintain fiscal discipline in the Indian economy. Fiscal reforms have brought a new vision and mission for the government, both central and state, towards competitiveness and efficient mode for managing the economy. In India, fiscal policy has played a pivotal role since independence, contributing significantly to the socio-economic development process of the country. Over the years, various instruments of fiscal policy, that is taxation, public expenditure and public borrowings, have been employed with varying degree of importance to achieve higher economic growth and stability, efficient resource allocation and equitable distribution of income. In India, fiscal policy does not operate in isolation as it has close macroeconomic linkages with real monetary and external sectors. Thus, the macroeconomic impact of fiscal policy is critical for achieving the broader economic goals. Adherence to fiscal legislation both at centre and state level is critical for macroeconomic, financial, external sector and budgetary sustainability. Fiscal empowerment, that is expanding the scope and size of revenue flows into the budget through tax reforms, appropriate user charges and restructuring of public sector undertakings, assumes critical importance. As the Indian economy becomes more open and integrated with the rest of the world, fiscal policy would have to face greater challenges. The approach to fiscal federalism, both in terms of addressing the vertical and horizontal imbalances, would have to focus on institutional reforms which align needs with revenue capacities. The changing demographic profile would make designing an appropriate fiscal policy more complex.